much less about how can I, kind of augment myself to fit into this beige, rigid box, but rather what can I do to almost break out of that and learn how to be comfortable with being me.
When you step back and do that, you step right out of the emotion of it and you start to become an observer. And then that allows you to start playing with that information more because you're not emotionally entrenched in it. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the ADHD Eavesdrop, where you can be a butterfly on the wall and listen in on my conversations. And who am I? I'm Janine VanStee. I'm an ADHD life coach who likes to help people better manage their symptoms and live the best lives that they can. Today with us, we have Beth Thomas. I'm really excited. Beth and I both graduated from the same program, not at the same time, but we've got a lot in common, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Beth's a public speaker on the lived experience of late diagnosed neurodivergence and recognized neurodiversity specialist, certified ADHD life coach, co-founder and director of Neuro Inclusive Link Limited, as well as a fierce advocate for neuro-inclusion. As a late diagnosed neurodivergent, recovering perfectionist herself, she blends lived experience together with professional trained skills and insights to offer impactful services in the realms of speaking, coaching, educating, and consulting. She has a background in performance with a BA or honors in literature and drama and theater studies, where she specialized in physical and immersive theater. She's been speaking more specifically on webinars, podcasts, and intimate stages for the last 2 years, delivering impactful work around topics of interest and experience after many years of suffering with challenges she eventually discovered to be related to undiagnosed neurodivergence. She crafts and performs engaging experiences, delivering maximum impact wherever she goes, and she has chosen to share this time with us today. So thank you so much, Beth, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Janine. I'm so thrilled to be here. This is really exciting. I'm so excited to have a conversation with you. How are you doing?
Good. I am also stoked. And I have to say, jumping right out the gate, the fact that you have a drama degree gets my heart because of our creativity, right? And I myself got my first IMDb this year. So I have an actress listing because I was in a film. So I too am a drama girl. So that kind of like struck my interest right away. So tell us more about yourself, Beth.
So yeah, late diagnosed neurodivergent person, growing up, sort of pegged as what is often termed as gifted and talented, or sort of twice gifted, but sort of lacking that really innate understanding of myself. And so what that actually meant was basically severe performance anxiety, somewhat ironically coming from a performance background, right? But sort of very much from an academic point of view, I had years and years of this narrative, expecting, being told that I have this, huge potential, and constantly thinking, yes, yeah, I must, and this must be true. But why is it I'm still struggling so much? Why do some of these arguably kind of, simple things feel so impossibly difficult? Yet in the same week, I could very easily go and, jump on a stage and perform in front of an audience, which for a lot of people would be terrifying, right? So, kind of growing up, there was often a sense of conflict or contradiction in pretty much everything that surrounded me, which was very difficult to pinpoint until much later, when I finally had that lens of neurodivergence and everything started making sense. So I think back then, and I'll be really excited to know if this is something that resonates with you as well, the performance spaces that I was in, the creativity, very much felt like an outlet, right? It was a chance to stim freely without feeling awkward or embarrassed or uncomfortable. It was a chance to kind of blurt out all of these colorful, weird, wacky, wonderful ideas without a sort of, oh gosh, is that linear enough? Is that logical enough? Are people going to get me? And it was embraced. And so naturally, I thrived there. Whereas if you were to catch me in, let's say, a mathematics class, oh my goodness, it would have been like looking at two different people. So yeah, I think that's why the creative and performance-based spaces will always have a really special place in my heart.
Oh, absolutely. And I've done more than one podcast on the fact that, neurodivergence and creativity, theater, the music, the arts, they go together. They do because of what, you say. It's so true. It's a chance for us to express ourselves in a safe way, right? And like my son-in-law pointed out to me, he's like, in the space of theater or in the space of art or whatever, you get that was a great job, you did a look at how beautiful this is or whatever. You get praise, praise, praise. But then you go into a classroom and you struggle to sit still and you struggle to do all the things that you need to do, and you get yelled at and get told you're not doing what you need to do. But your space where you get praise and recognition is in that creative space.
Oh, I absolutely yes. I mean, that for me brings up so many memories of almost quite hilariously to look back now, moments where I might just be fidgeting, moving in a way that I almost, it's difficult to explain, but felt compelled to, that was more comfortable, as it were. And depending on the space you were in, the feedback and the outcome would be so different. So in a performancey space, in a creative space, someone would pick up and they go, "Oh, do that again. Oh, yeah, I can see how I can fit this in, and oh, let me add that to this." And then all of a sudden, you kind of having a bit of a fidget or a stim or a move would suddenly create a beautiful piece of art or expression or a
Mhm.
scene or a movement-based piece or something. Whereas doing that in, much more rigid structures, it would be, "Oh, Beth, stop fidgeting. You're making me seasick." And, the contrast is phenomenal, and it still exists today. I was in classrooms 20 years ago, and arguably not a great deal has changed. We might have, sort of a bit more awareness now, but the horror stories that I still continue to hear from parents and people who support the educational spaces, much the same, which is yeah, a challenge for sure.
Absolutely. So, when I do my podcast, I always ask folks to share a few things that they might be interested in talking about in the session. So, internalized ableism, shame and perfectionism in late diagnosed neurodivergent individuals, and burnout. All good topics.
And thank goodness you actually had that prep in advance, hey, because I'm not sure I would have remembered even one of those.
So, yeah, what would you like to say on those topics?
Oh, wow. Great question, first and foremost. So thank you for asking. I suppose for me, the passion piece here, maybe, or the thing that I feel most strongly about when I come to talking on these topics is being able to spend a moment to validate that one of the reasons I find them so important is because they're not just parts of my experience, but they're also really frequent things that come up in my coaching and my consulting spaces. And that really kind of gives me this rich data that absolutely screams, we need to have louder conversations about these things, guys, because they're often things that, as a result of the shame and the ableism at play, we're not having conversations about on a day to day. We might be afraid, we might be a little bit worried, or we might be embarrassed, but for whatever reason, they're not necessarily things that we can talk about in our day-to-day conversations or the various domains in which we kind of move in on a day-to-day basis. So what then tends to happen is we take all of these experiences and they start getting bottled up or boxed up, and they swirl around, they don't go anywhere, and they're not getting expressed or processed or kind of talked about to a point where we can validate the experience or we can process it in a way that's helpful to us. So, first and foremost, the reason I like talking about them is because they're things that a lot of us can relate to,
Mhm.
non neurotype specific, really. So, for me, that is one of the reasons. And I'm going to have to really embrace my lack of working memory and ask you to remind me the topics because I've already forgotten the specific ones.
So let me tell you the topic that stuck out to me the most, and that is the shame and perfectionism. I
Yeah.
see it so often where like it seems like sometimes it's the first two or three sessions with a new client, it almost inevitably comes up that they want to be perfect and
Yeah.
that they have shame around not being perfect. It's such a common theme. And
Sure.
what would be a piece of advice from you when talking about that type of shame and that type of, holding yourself back or feeling like you're not perfect? What comes up?
Well, that's, yeah, a great way of framing the conversation around this. So, I mean, depending on the question, I suppose, that was being presented, my advice would likely begin with some form of encouragement to get curious,
Hmm.
approach without a sense of judgment or expectation, a a curiosity of, oh, what's coming up for me here, and I wonder why that is, and where it might be coming from, and then what might it be trying to keep me safe from? Because one of the real kind of game changers for me when I explore limiting beliefs, my own, other people's, is that sort of almost backward sense that our limiting beliefs we can rationalize might be holding us back, but in the moment are actually trying really hard to keep us safe from something, right? So let's put this into an example. Often perfectionism is an attempt, among many things, to keep us safe from being vulnerable because we might have learned somewhere along the way that being vulnerable is negative. It might be trying to keep us safe from rejection, similarly, because we might have learned somewhere along the way that rejection is really painful and it hurts. And we wouldn't want to do that. Why would we want to willingly go towards the things that hurt us, right? It might be, in a way, trying to keep us safe from success. That's unknown. That's unfamiliar. We don't know what that looks like. We can't control that. Oh my goodness. There's no blueprint there. So why would we do that? And actually, if we look at it in that way, it makes a whole bunch of sense. So getting curious about it rather than judging is a really useful way of engaging with that challenge in a way that doesn't contribute to the shame we might be feeling around it, right? Because if we start going in with a bit of judgment, oh, I should be better at this, I should have gotten this sooner, or I should have, gotten 100% instead of 95, then we're automatically kind of beating ourselves with that metaphorical shame stick. And definitely the last time I checked, and I do tend to check quite regularly in on this in case it changes, that never really helped us grow, right? It often left us in that fixed mindset, didn't it? And doesn't it, right? It continues to. So when we go in with that sense of judgment and those shoulds and ought tos and need tos, we create quite a fixed expectation of ourselves that doesn't often create much space for flourishing and growing. And one of the most uncomfortable things that myself and my perfectionism have to relearn often is that we have to find a way to embrace the imperfection as a neutral part of life. So
Hmm.
for me, I struggle quite a lot with binary thinking, rigid thinking. It's either this or it's that. I'm either perfect or it's a total failure. And I'm a total failure. And so therefore I
Hmm.
should never try unless it's perfect. And we start seeing that perpetual self-sabotaging cycle start to kick in. And
Yes,
if we can
absolutely.
take a moment back and approach with curiosity and say, okay, how about we try and create some neutral, metaphorical neutral space in the middle where it's neither good or bad, right or wrong, but it is simply data, and we can learn how to be comfortable as much as possible in the discomfort of the messy, then
Well, and if I can add,
mm,
it also allows us to when we approach things with curiosity, and that is one of my favorites as well, and I use it with myself in the political climate of my country right now. I'm trying to use that and just be curious. And so curiosities, I definitely use curiosity quite a bit with my clients and with myself because it's such it's a great tool. It allows us to step out of the emotion. So when you approach with curiosity, you have to step back from the situation to, see the things that are happening. But when you step back and do that, you step right out of the emotion of it and you start to become an observer. And then that allows you to start playing with that information more because you're not emotionally entrenched in it.
Oh, that is such a beautiful way of describing. I love that, entrenched in it. Such a good visual. I'm a really visual person, and I completely agree. And I think that's a really valuable point to add to that experience because often creeps up on us, right? Without us even realizing. We can get really stuck into it with the emotions, which are always often quite intense and raw and understandably messy. And if we don't have that, oh, let me just take a step back. Sometimes we can get really caught up in that rawness, which can be really difficult to gain perspective on.
And for our neurodivergent folks, I mean, we tend to be impulsive. And by taking that step back, you've put a barrier between you and an impulsive decision. As
Oh,
soon
that's
as soon as you take that step back and become the observer, you have put something there that says, I'm not going to have an impulsive reaction.
yes. Oh, that is so, so valuable. And also something I enjoy being transparent about, often having to remind myself, because this is a really great example of how our path is never linear, right? And especially for me, I really resonate with that and putting those steps in to take that step back to, not always have those impulsive, reactive kind of responses to things is really helpful. Also helps with the rumination, I tend to find. If I go in with impulsive reaction, I'm much more likely to ruminate on it after in a sort of unhealthier way. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, why did I say that? Where did that come from? Oh my goodness, now that person's going to be really upset or offended. Maybe I was insensitive. They didn't get whatever it is. Whereas if we take that step back and we can process and we can give ourselves time to actually feel those things without maybe them having a possibly, detrimental impact, we can a little bit like a, what do I want to say? There's a visual coming to me like with, when you're in a car and the safety bags. What are they called?
Oh, the airbags, yeah.
Bags, yes. It's kind of a little bit like having airbags on everything you do, right? To prevent any sort of further damage.
Exactly, exactly. So as soon as you hit an obstacle, the airbag goes off. We become curious. We step back. We slow the impulsivity and step out of the deepness of the emotion. I love it. It's great.
Oh, there we go. Airbags. I love it. Oh, I do love
Summing it
airbags.
all right up there. It's awesome.
Put your airbags in. Amazing. I think that's one of my favorite things about working with clients is so many clients, when you work with such a variety, as you will do as a coach, they bring you the most incredible ways of looking at the world. That some of the visuals and the analogies and the metaphors and the ways of seeing things that I've learned from clients is phenomenal. It honestly, it's such a joy, and a real privilege to hold space in that way. But yeah, I absolutely love those visuals because what the way I might describe something like with the airbag example is going to be totally different to how someone else might describe it. And that's really exciting, I think, to me sometimes. I don't know about you.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I always like it when I get a new little tidbit of information. I'm like, ooh, I gotta write that down. Let me write that down real quick.
That is literally in my world. It's a post-it note somewhere where I thought, oh gosh, I need to absolutely write that down and take note, and whiteboard behind me of things. I'm like, yes, must remember that.
I don't do post-it notes. I have this thick little pad of paper that I use.
No, I actually have a similar one, and this is such a neurodivergent thing. I love it. We're sharing the stationery we have. I have a similar one, which is a list format. So I
Very
keep it
nice.
keep it within an arm's reach. So anytime I have a thought that kind of pops in and doesn't have anywhere to go, it goes straight down onto that. Or I'll use a post-it note if I need to visually make sense of things, or if I'm sort of feeling a bit stuck, I might sort of pop a few ideas down on, sort of the post-its, move them around a bit until I go, that's it. Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, cool. I know what I'm doing now. And then that becomes, I don't know, a blog or a piece of work I'm doing
Yeah,
or something like
and you'll notice that a lot of neurodivergent people do similar things, manipulate their information and have it in a way that they can play with it because it changes a lot.
that.
And I love that about people with neurodivergence is that, they've always got little sticky notes everywhere and they've always got a ton of things going, but it's not very organized to the rest of the world. But to us, it kind of makes sense. And so that kind of comes into that perfectionism thing where if the system works for you
Mhm.
and everybody else is using this system, but this system works for you, it's perfect for you.
Exactly. And I think that that touches really nicely on one of my favorite phrases, which is it doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. It just needs to make sense to you. If it makes sense to you, then we are absolutely on that path. And that is another really exciting thing about coaching because you get to create that whilst identifying, getting curious about, and reframing any of those possible limiting beliefs that might have previously created a bit of a shame-based narrative that might have held us back from feeling like we can use it. And that's such an exciting journey for people to go on. Oh, actually,
Mhm.
what do you mean I can? I can do it in this way? Sure can, absolutely.
Why
You
not?
use the want. What exactly? Why not? Oh, because I should do it this way because that's more normal. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And
Can't
that's
stop
where we
shitting on yourself.
exactly right. Yeah, 100%. And that is where that kind of perfectionism colludes so successfully with the ableism to kind of keep you stuck in these loops of sort of, I don't know, systems and structures and processes that ultimately don't work best with your brain and
Hmm.
don't necessarily enable you to thrive in that way. Which I think is a really helpful way of exploring the world, especially when things previously might have felt so rigid. It's much less about how can I, kind of augment myself to fit into this beige rigid box, but rather, you know, what can I do to almost break out of that and learn how to be comfortable with being me, which might very well include checking in with that perfectionism and that ableism.
Absolutely. And when I here in the base of all of these things, myself in coaching and as we're talking about it, it just brings back to me the need for external validation in looking at others and thinking, well, if it's perfect for them, then that's how it's going to be perfect for me. And looking outside of yourself for what's valid for you rather than what looking within. And I think a lot of people with ADHD are so busy trying to just fit in and look like everybody else and act like everybody else that they forget that. And maybe don't even really ever develop that it's me who gives myself value, not everybody else. And that's a hard one.
Oh my gosh, Janine, that is one of the trickiest things, at least in my journey, for sure, I can really relate to. I mean, what you just said there was pretty much what fast tracked me to burnout in my experience. Trying to look for that validation and, this is Beth in what worked for everybody else was the quickest way I lost myself entirely. And, you know, that led to a lot of scary places in my past. That led to a lot of, sort of different ways that were very unhealthy to me because when you're not aligning yourself with what works for you best and how you can be your authentic self, you put yourself at so much more of a risk of needing to then lean into other things to help you cope. And
Hmm.
often at that from a neurodivergent perspective, I think it is important to say we're much more likely for those things to very quickly become very destructive because of, how much dopamine it might give us, or how easy it might be for us to sort of fall into that habit, and all of that kind of challenge that revolves around it, for sure. And then it becomes really scary for different reasons, because once you've gotten yourself into that place, you've got to figure out how the path back, as it were, or the path
Mhm.
forward, the way you want to look at it. And that also means you getting curious with yourself and trying not to be really hard on yourself for all of those decisions that you might have made that may not have been the best for you, may not have served you, and finding a way that you can make peace with a lot of that, which is pretty tough for a lot of people, especially when you've got to sit with, let's say, your rejection sensitivity, and challenges with your emotional regulation. I mean, as a lived experience example, previously to me knowing my neurodivergence, I would have described myself as a very active emotional volcano. The littlest thing, right, could have set me off. I mean, oh my goodness, it could have been someone didn't listen to me. I might have been talking for 20 minutes, but they didn't listen to me. And so that could have really, triggered a sort of quote unquote, but what's the word? Huge response to something that arguably to them might have looked very small, but to me it felt really big, and
Mhm.
that was a real struggle. And it
So
wasn't until later I realized and went, oh, okay, I see that all now.
yeah, see, and that's where I wanted to go next is your diagnosis, because you were late diagnosed, and was your burnout part of that?
So fascinatingly, no, it's
Hmm.
really interesting. Yeah, so I did not have a sort of a typical, if we can use that word, route into diagnoses. And pretty much what I have observed so far is you tend to have one of two main sort of pathways into figuring this stuff out. So you were often either kind of ostracized when you were growing up, and there was something quote wrong with you, and so that would spark this journey, and then you'd be diagnosed as a kid. Happy days, you grow up knowing about it. Or you weren't picked up earlier on. You might have fallen through the cracks because you were good at masking or coping or whatever it was that kind of veiled any of those potential sort of characteristics, as I prefer to call them, of your neurodivergence. And so you get through life until you reach what a lot of sort of medical professionals tend to call a bit of a tipping point, where you start really struggling. And that struggle then triggers a bit of a search for answers. And that's how often a lot of people walk into a later diagnosis, right? They might have struggled for years with anxiety or depression or eating disorders or addictions. They might have tried lots of different treatments. They might have watched a TikTok. They might have had a child and the child got diagnosed. So many different avenues, but all of which lead to that sense of curiosity that leads you eventually to the diagnosis. And I had neither of them, Janine, neither of them. And I'll tell you why. Because I was incredibly good at masking. Well, at least I thought I was anyway, until about 2019, when I had comfortably long graduated university, and at the point was very lost. And I was working in a gym. I loved working in the gym actually, because it had enough variety. I was class instructor, PT, all of this fun stuff. Very kind of an environment that very much suited that need to move. And I was really enjoying it, but I'd kind of finished all the qualifications. So I was starting to get a little bit bored and fidgety, as I often did. So I was looking for a new challenge. And within that gym environment, actually met a psychiatrist who was looking for, at the time, it started out as very ad hoc sort of personal assistant type work to help him manage his very early private practice. And he had sort of intentions of developing that into a little bit more of a robust private practice. And so I thought, well, I've just done a literature degree. I'm pretty good with my words, and I might not be able to organize myself, but I'm very good at organizing other people. And I've got all of these kind of skills that I think could be quite good here. And so we kind of decided to do a bit of a trial, And really, that was the start of the journey I'm on now. So it was during that time I remember helping him to organize, the clinical reports, etc., supporting the clients, getting them booked in, taking all of their pre-diagnostic paperwork, etc. And I said, wow. I remember one really casual, I don't know, Sunday afternoon conversation. I said, wow, isn't it really amazing or fascinating that I am resonating with all of the people that seem to be getting positively diagnosed with ADHD? I mean, our stories are just, mirror image. I remember he kind of turned around to me with that like almost incredulous look, being like, you do realize that's because you're very ADHD too. And it was like, I couldn't pick my jaw up off the floor quick enough. I thought, what? Yeah, and initially it was kind of that classic grief process of like straight up denial. No, you're having me on. That's not the case at all. And then it kind of stuck with me and it rattled around in the back of my brain for quite a while. And it went from like, oh no, that's not possibly true to, oh, what could that be? Maybe. But obviously that wasn't a formal diagnosis and it wouldn't have been, appropriate. It would have been a huge conflict of interest for him to formally diagnose me. So it kind of rolled around, as I said, in the back of my brain for a while until I got to a point where I started going, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. Yeah, maybe I can accept that as a very likely possibility. So that ultimately led to a formal diagnostic pathway, which I have actually only in the last 12 months or so actually finally completed after relevant waiting lists and forgetting to fill out paperwork and all sorts that comes with it. Because I might be a coach, but that doesn't mean I don't still have those traits of ADHD, right?
Yes,
So
let's
yeah,
let's keep that out there. We are not perfect and don't have all the answers for helping you find your answers, and we're looking for our own at the same time.
I love to hear it. And honestly, we couldn't say this louder, could we? The amount of times I just pause for a moment and share that to really not just manage expectations, but also to validate, right? Because I say we're still figuring it out too. We can be really excellent coaches. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have all of the answers for ourselves, and that certainly doesn't mean we'll have the answers for you. That's not what a coach does.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, that's my story and how we got to where we are now.
Well, congratulations on finally getting the diagnosis. Now, are you medicated?
So I'm on a waiting list for medication. I'm not sure if you're super aware of where things stand currently in the UK, but we have a bit of a bottleneck situation, which I think is quite relative for most of the world, really. But because we can only have it prescribed by either a psychiatrist or a very highly trained specialist prescriber, both of which are incredibly rare to get access to at the moment. Depending on where you are in the country, will be how long you're waiting for. And the county that I'm in has one of the worst wait times.
Oh no.
So I've finally gotten all of the assessment paperwork. So I'm now on another waiting list for the titration phase, of course. So I will be at least 2 years away from any sort of real access to that, I think. So I think that's another reason for me personally that holistic management of my challenges is so crucial because
Mhm.
at the moment with building what I'm building at the, kind of independently, I wouldn't be able to justify the costs of private prescriptions and follow-ups, and then to have a battle with my NHS prescriber who probably wouldn't accept a shared care agreement anyway would be arduous, a lot of energy and a lot of money and time that I simply don't have.
Mhm.
So that's why at this point in time it's essential for me to manage everything with things like exercise and nutrition and coaching and supervision.
Yeah, I know a few folks over in the UK and in Ireland, and they have said, pretty much the same thing. The waiting list is is a joy to behold.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it really baffles me because at the same time we have this almost kind of like, oh gosh, scary, amber controlled substance, so we couldn't possibly touch that. You'll also get, oh, but we could give you some antidepressants in the meantime, or we could give you 10 sessions of CBT, and we think,
Right.
how effective are these things going to be for people? And
Mhm.
if they're not necessarily the right kinds of support to be providing someone, why are we offering them? Yeah, it's certainly something to be curious about for sure. I
Here's
often
your
think,
consolation prize kind of thing.
exactly right. Yeah, so
We
I don't
recognize your suffering here. Try this.
it's kind of, yeah, it's a little bit like you walk into an A&E with, I don't know, like a big old sort of, I don't know, laceration, you're quite clearly bleeding, and they're like, yeah, we can't fix that right now, but we can give you an MRI. I mean, I guess, but why? It might help, but it's probably not going to. And in the
That
meantime, you're wasting resources. Oh my goodness. Yeah, never ceases to baffle me. Yeah, we can have a conversation about that point all day long, just on its own. So don't get me started.
Yeah, and like it's interesting because in the United States, our insurance and our medical care obviously works very differently than yours does. There are still waiting lists. There are still, periods that, take more time. But like my family doctor could prescribe my medication. He doesn't because I have a psychiatrist. Not a lot of people have psychiatrists because there are not a lot of them out there. I happen to have a family psychiatrist who takes care of everybody in our family because we all have ADHD. We eventually found out, and including my mother, who's diagnosed at 79. So, we're just a family of ADHDers. And fortunately, she was on top of things and had seen with me, I'd been diagnosed with anxiety, all the things, right? And she was the one who said, I'm seeing a little ADHD here. And yeah, just a little, and I'm like, no. I've been working with people with ADHD my whole life. I would know if I have ADHD. You're silly. And then I find out, indeed, I do have ADHD. And everybody around me is like, well, of course you do.
That's such an interesting thing. I wish we'd spoke more about as well, right? Everyone else's reactions. You either get microaggressions of like, no, you don't look ADHD, or you tend to get, well, yeah, duh, obviously. And you're like,
Everybody knew
really?
that. You're right. It is the opposite extremes because you get either, of course you are, or you're way too successful. Like
That
I had a 30-year, successful education career, and people are looking at me like, no, you're way too successful. Doesn't have anything to do with it.
absolutely. And again, feeding kind of back to that perfectionism we were talking about earlier, that is another barrier that creates such a hardship for people to grapple with the idea that actually, yes, firstly, you can be both. And secondly, this could be you. And
Hmm.
that difficult for a lot of people because I think, oh God, that can't exist because clearly I've achieved these accolades, which means I couldn't possibly. And that's where we think, well, to what extent are the stereotypes of ADHD and other neurodivergencies still continuing to, limit people's access to understanding themselves better?
Absolutely. Well, Beth, we have had a great conversation.
Marvelous. Thank you so much for having me.
It has been a lot of fun. I'd like to ask my people one last question just to give you a chance to get a few words in at the end. And so it depends on the person what question I ask. But my question for you is what would be the number one, aside from curiosity, what would be the number one piece of advice you might give somebody who's suffering from burnout?
That is a really good question. And to that, I would say be gentle with yourself and give yourself as much grace as you probably do judgment. And by that, I mean go as gently as you need to, because one of the difficulties in recovering from burnout is often our expectation of how quickly we can do it. And burnout is often a term that's been really thrown around and diluted as a result. And burnout's no joke. So if you are, one of those people that really resonates with the sort of, high performing, high flying, always go, go, go person that all of a sudden is really struggling with burnout, it's so important that you treat yourself as kindly, as compassionately, and as gently as you would with, any other really obvious, let's say, injury or illness.
Mm. Amen. So, with that, Beth, thank you again so much for being on the show. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And for our butterflies who are listening on the wall, if they enjoy our content, if they like what they're hearing, we hope that they subscribe and come back for more, because I love to share information and give things out to people that might just help them. One little thing you hear may just help you in some way, and that's my goal. So with that, we'll see you next time.